My screen?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so we are so welcome everybody to part 2 of demystifying the manuscript submission process. So last week we had a great discussion on sort of, what happens before you submit and what you should be doing, and getting all of your ducks aligned and ready to submit. And this week we're going to focus on what happens after you've hit the submit button. Pam and Amy Pam's going to talk a little bit about what happens behind the scenes once you've submitted your paper. I'm going to talk briefly about how to respond to reviewer comments without, throwing your computer out the window. Amy's going to follow up with talking about how search engine optimization and, optimizing your keywords and how you set up your paper so that it can be found easily by both human readers and electronic means, so that your paper gets sort of as widely disseminated as it can be. And I think we're going to wrap up again with some of the Q&A questions that we had when you all registered that are more pertinent to today's topic. So just as a quick reminder, here's who's going to be your helpers for this. So Pam's going to be talking today about the behind the scenes process. So what happens once you've submitted. She's eminently qualified to lead this discussion as editor-in-chief for AJB for how long have you been at AJB, Pam?
8 years, I think.
Okay, yeah, so plenty of experience. And then Brianna Gross, again, we have as our other editor-in-chief for applications in plant sciences, so she can chip in with some additional information. And then the director of publications and managing editor for AJB, Amy McPherson, will be dealing with all of the electronic part. And I'm just an interested bystander. So I'm a newly hired assistant professor at George Mason. And my role here is as someone who has gone through the publication process a few times at this point. And yeah, so at that point, I think let's go ahead and switch over to Pam and let you get started. I'm gonna stop my sharing.
Okay, do I have permission to share?
Yep.
Okay.
Should. Should be a share screen at the bottom.
Yeah, did that work? Are you seeing my screen? Mm-hmm. Yeah?
No, not yet.
Oh.
There we go. Yes. Perfect.
I thought there was another button. All right, sorry for the delay. So thanks everybody for coming. And as Brittany said, I'm gonna kind of talk you through the process of what happens when you push that button. And the idea is that kind of understanding what's going on in the background can better equip you to have the best outcome possible in terms of managing your paper, managing your expectations, and so forth. So yeah, what happens once you submit a manuscript? And so these are basically the key players. It's going to differ a little bit from journal to journal in terms of who these people are and how many of them there are. But there's you, the author. There's the managing editor, who's typically a professional trained in the publishing industry. And then there's the more academic side of things, one or more editors-in-chief, a large number of either associate editors or editors. They have different titles. These are the people that will actually handle your paper, and then the reviewers. So once you push that button, it goes to the journal office and is initially handled by the managing editor, who takes a look at it and evaluates it for, is it botany? Is it appropriate for the journal? Or all the pieces there? And that sort of thing. If not, then it comes back to you to finish, adding what's needed or whatever. it's appropriate as far as the managing editor is concerned, then it moves on to the editor-in-chief, who will then evaluate the paper. Is it suitable for the journal? Is it significant enough to meet the standards of the journal for publication? And to do that, I'm going to read through your abstract. I'm going to read through your cover letter. And hopefully I have enough information based on those two things to not have to go take a dive through your paper, your introduction or your discussion, and I'm able to make an evaluation. So if I decide that it's not appropriate for the journal, I will write a summary of that decision, and I'll return it to you without sending it on to a reviewer. If I do decide that it's potentially appropriate for the journal, I'll send it on to an associate editor. And at the American Journal of Botany, we have close to 60 different associate editors who have expertise in a diverse array of botanical topics. And so in choosing an associate editor, I'll try to match their expertise with the topic of your paper. But you can also have a look at the associate editors associated with a journal. So most journals will, in their information page, will have a list of their associate editors and information about them. So this is the link to our associate editor page. And here's 4 of our terrific associate editors. And you're welcome at most journals to recommend an associate editor that you think would be appropriate for your paper. Doesn't necessarily mean that person will handle it, because we need to sort of manage the load of these different people and how many papers they're handling. But it's always welcome. Suggestions are always welcome. So the associate editor is also, yeah.
Real quick, would that be information that should go in the cover letter?
It can't, there's actually, at AJB, there's a space to fill that in, but it can also go in your cover letter.
Okay.
That suggestion. It's always helpful to say why too. Not that they're your best friend or something. Yeah, good point. So, but just because I've sent it to an associate editor doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to go out for review. So I also rely on the associate editors to evaluate the appropriateness of that paper for the journal, right? So is that, by this time, it's sort of in our wheelhouse in terms of things we publish, but it may not be, it may be that the science just it doesn't clear the bar that we set for our publications. And if that's the case, then the associate editor will write an evaluation of their assessment of the paper and send it back to me with the recommendation that it's not appropriate. And then I'll send it back to you. And this may seem harsh, right, that we're making these decisions without external review, but it's actually to your benefit not to have to wait for this review process. And it's also, there's a lot of papers out there being reviewed, and so not a paper that probably isn't going to be successful. It saves everyone effort not to send that out for review. So it comes back to you, and you can essentially use the comments of the associate editor to either make changes in the paper or determine another more suitable journal. Okay, so, but assuming that the associate editor at least has the preliminary assessment that your paper is appropriate for the journal, they'll send that on to reviewers. And we talked a little bit about this last week. It's perfect. It's actually really important that you select reviewers, or that you suggest reviewers when you're sending your paper in, because actually finding reviewers for papers is a very time-consuming process, because typically we like to get 2 reviews, but oftentimes we need to ask many times, many different people before we get 2 people to agree to do the review. I forget, what's our record, Amy?
I'm not sure, but I did see an editor on Twitter say that they went through 36 names.
Oh my.
I don't know
Wow.
that we've gotten that far, but that's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. 10 is not unusual, but
10 is not.
I think
definitely
Harold's
can
got a question. Yeah.
expedite the process by suggesting reviewers. Harold, did you have a comment?
Yes, Pam, at the point where an associate editor turns it back, do you ever request that they suggest another journal that might be more appropriate? In other words, try to help the author assign or send it to the best place.
Yeah, we often do suggest journals that might be more appropriate to try to be constructive and helpful.
Right.
And also our publisher Wiley also will do an internal referral.
Right.
Oh,
Good.
that's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
That's,
Yeah, so there's an option to go to another Wiley journal without resubmitting, right?
Right. Mhm.
Yeah. Good point.
that's good.
All right, so the associate editor then selects and requests experts in the field to review the paper. And then they either agree to do it or they decline. And then in that case, the associate editor asks another person and another person and another person. But eventually, we get a couple of people who agree to review the paper, again, based on the assumption from the information that they have that this is potentially a publishable paper. So the point I want to make to you now that's really important is that we've gone through, you can see this decision tree here, right? We've gone through a lot of decisions about the fate of your paper, and many of these critical decisions may have been made on the parts of your paper that many of us spend the least amount of time on, right? So I get your paper, I look at the title, I look at the abstract, I look at the cover letter. If you've written a good cover letter and haven't just repeated the abstract in your cover letter, right? So this is the information that I'm going on, that the associate editor is going on, that the reviewers are going on, right? We're not each going to sit and read your paper carefully as we're making these decisions. So it really, really is important that you spend some time thinking about these aspects of your paper and what they communicate about what's in your paper. So going back to, and Amy's going to talk a little bit more about this in detail, because you're actually talking to two different audiences at two different times, right? You're talking to me, you're talking to the associate editor, you're talking to the reviewers when you're composing your title and your abstract. But you're also talking to your peers, because those are the people that you want to read your paper once it comes out. But you're also talking to a machine, right? You're talking to artificial intelligence that are going to be, creepy crawling, looking to make your paper accessible. So there's a lot of different audiences that you're trying to target. And so Amy's going to talk a little bit about choosing an effective title. But again, thinking about, you're talking to me, you're talking to an editor, you're talking to a reviewer. Does the title tell you what the paper is about? Is the title compelling? Does it make me want to read the paper? Similarly, when you're writing your abstract, does it tell me what your research is about? Can I get it from reading the abstract? What's the question? What did you find out? Make me want to read your paper. So, I find abstracts super hard and super tedious to write. I don't like it. I think many of us do it at the last minute. So don't. Spend some time on it. And then finally, Brittany talked last time about the importance of a cover letter. And I just want to reiterate, cover letter is your chance to tell me and the other editors why your paper should be published. It's not a repetition of your abstract. So be careful of that. Okay, lecture over. Back to what's happening to your paper. So reviewers will read your paper in great detail, write a review, make a recommendation back to the associate editor. So the associate editor will read those reviews carefully. Usually the associate editor will also read the paper and comment, but that varies from journal to journal, varies from reviewer to, or associate editor to associate editor. But the associate editor will digest all of this, their own opinion, the reviewer's opinions, and make a recommendation to me. And I've listed the various recommendations from accept all the way to reject. And I'm going to tell you my version of what those mean in a minute. But the associate editor then makes a recommendation. Oops, wait. went backwards, makes an associate, makes a recommendation to the editor-in-chief. And again, this works a little bit differently in different journals. Sometimes the associate editor, that's the last word, and the associate editor is just, managing higher order things. At the American Journal of Botany and many other journals, the decision comes from the associate editor as a recommendation. And so I also look at all the information. I look at the reviews. I look at the associate editor's comments. They'll usually explain to me and to the author the basis of their recommendation, right? What are the strong points of the manuscript? What are things that the authors actually need to be concerned about improving? And so I'll digest all of that and make my decision. So let's go through these decisions. So the accept, that's pretty clear. The paper is accepted for publication pending other formatting and issues and things that we'll talk about in a minute. If the decision is minor revisions, those are mostly requests for clarification. Some sentences need to be rewritten. Maybe your methods need to be explained more clearly. There may be some extraneous information that needs to be weeded out, but those are the kind of changes that are considered minor. Major revision still means that the science is sound, right? The reviewers believe they accept your conclusions. They think your conclusions have been justified, but the revisions are going to be a little bit more intensive than minor revisions. So perhaps the introduction needs to be rewritten so that the goals or the questions are framed more clearly. Sometimes there's changes needed to clarify some of the methods, things like that. But if at least at the American Journal of Botany, if the decision is major revision, it means that we think that if you make those revisions and explain to us what you've done, that we can evaluate that revision without sending it back to the reviewers for their evaluation. It also means that those revisions are not going to change the meaning of the science, right? There's not any changes to how that's supported. If the decision is major revision with additional review, those changes are pretty substantive. It still means the science is sound. We think that your conclusions are, for the most part, justified, but it may be that we're requiring some more data analysis or reanalysis, different analysis. And it may be that as you do that, your conclusions are going to change a little bit, or else the kind of restructuring we're asking for is enough that somebody really needs to sit down with that paper and review it in its entirety. So that's what additional review means. And it'll go back to one or both of the original reviewers for their evaluation. Reject with the possibility of resubmission. That means that the paper still has some really good core in it, but it really needs to be reworked before it can be considered for publication. So if it comes back, it's going to be a new paper. May have the same data, but it's going to be a new paper, and so it needs to be treated as a new submission. And then a reject is, thanks, but we don't want to see this again. Is maybe not such a nice way to say it, but it means that even with substantive revision, the paper is unlikely to meet the journal standards. Sometimes it's that there's a fatal flaw, or just a general lack of enthusiasm for whatever the contribution the paper may make. So I'll go ahead with one of those decisions and then send that back to you as the author. And so now you get the reviewer's comments, the associate editor's comments, and the editor-in-chief comments, my comments, all of which you need to sit down and digest really carefully. So
I had a question.
Yeah.
You use the word reject, and that's pretty standard. Would it be better to say decline? It doesn't seem as harsh, and I've always wondered about that.
Yeah, that's the what that's the language that's in the pull down menu. I think what the wording in our decision letter says that the paper will not be published. It doesn't say that the paper is rejected. Yeah, Amy.
Yeah, another thing, if you've written a paper that's been declined or rejected by one journal, it doesn't mean that that's the end of the life of the paper, because most
Right.
papers that are submitted will eventually get published. I'll talk a little bit in my presentation about resubmitting your work to another journal. Don't want to just submit a rejected manuscript to a new journal without modification, but certainly that's not the end of the road. That's not necessarily the end of the road for that paper, of course.
Absolutely. And Brittany had a nice graph last week about, you know, how many times it takes for different papers to get submitted.
It will take more time, but it will eventually find a home.
Yes,
Yeah.
Nearly always.
That's right. Finding a home. That's it.
Okay. And we also talked last week about, you know, reviews, right? And so I just want to emphasize from last week that most reviewers are working really hard and they spend a lot of time on your paper. They're trying to be helpful. They're trying to make all of our science better. But, you know, they're human too, right? And so sometimes what they write might not be so diplomatic as it could be, or it may be downright hurtful sometimes. We hope that that kind of thing doesn't happen too much, but you know, those comments get in, and any criticism is really hard to take. So when you get these reviews, just take a deep breath, ask for clarification if necessary, revise as you see fit, right? So these are, they're not dictates. You can evaluate those requests. And then when you're ready, so Brittany's going to talk about how to respond to reviewers. And Brittany, I'll turn this over to you in a sec, or should I just finish up what I'm doing?
Go ahead and finish up.
Okay.
No,
So we're going to come back to dealing with reviewers. So just hold that in your head. We're going to come back. But once you're ready, once you've followed Brittany's advice, then you're going to submit that revision back to the journal. And as you do that, you want to prepare a response. And the goal of your response to the reviewers is to make it as easy as possible for the associate editors and the reviewers, if it's going to go back to the reviewers, to understand what you've done, right? And so the easier you can make it for that person to figure out what you've done, if you've done a good job, is to be very clear in that cover letter. So a nice way to do it is for each reviewer comment or each associate editor comment, you put right below that, you copy and paste it in your cover letter. Right below that, you say what you've done. And it's even better if you can give the page and line number where that change is, right? And so you can explain what you've done. The reviewer can go back and read it and see if it works into where you've put it. And it's okay not to make all the changes, but if you don't think that change is appropriate, then you have to explain why. You can't just say no. That doesn't work. Then just to finish up, how long does all this take, right? We've gone through a lot of aspects of what's all going on in the background while you're, thumping, I'm trying to tap my fingers on my table, waiting and waiting and waiting for this decision to come back. So how long should it take? Well, this is my best case scenario timeline that I've put out. So the paper comes into the office. Depending on how much is going on there, it might take a couple of days before that gets sent along to me. And then depending on what's going on in my life, because remember, all these people, except the managing editor, have full-time jobs doing something else, right? So all this stuff is getting done in the background while they're doing other things. So depending on my schedule, it may take me a day, or it may take me, a working week to get it out to an associate editor. Then they have to find time in their day to, again, read through at least your abstract to figure out. Sometimes they'll actually read the whole paper to figure out, whether it should go out for review. And if so, who can review it? And then after that, when they, then you have to keep asking people because it takes a long time to find reviewers. And then reviewers, they have to find time in their day to do the review. And then it all kind of comes back the other way. And so very best case scenario, if everybody is sort of jumping on this right away, it takes about 4 weeks. The average pre-pandemic time schedule for American Journal of Botany was about 33 working days. It's a lot longer than that now. It's just been really hard for everybody's, just super stressed out. So it's taking longer. But, so if you get your paper back in just a little over a month, I think that's a pretty superhuman accomplishment on everybody's part. Okay, so you've got your paper back, everybody approves. What happens then? So just briefly, it's going to go then from being accepted to a content editor who's going to go over it for journal requirements, formatting, funding sources, data deposition, and all of that. And then you get to see it again to create the final version. And I think I'm going to sort of just skip over this part and remind you of what Brittany told you last time, that most journals now require your data to be publicly available, and AJB will certainly require it to be deposited before your paper can be published. And then I think the last comment or piece of advice I want to make is once your paper has been copy edited, which I want to give a shout out for AJB that we provide super great copy editing, which is not a service that most journals are supplying anymore. But once you've got your copy edited version back to us, we're going to turn around page proofs. What, Amy, within 10 days or so? I've forgotten.
We're going to consult our publication editor, who's also on this call. Rich, how long does it take?
Yeah, it's 7 to 10 days.
So then it's going to come back to you, and then you have you're going to get what are called page proofs, which is basically what your article is going to look at, like with some questions, queries about, various things that we found that may be a problem in your proofs. You have a very short window of time to turn those around. So, when you have a paper that's close to coming out, pay attention to your email and hop on this. And I just want to emphasize, this is your last chance to make sure that your paper is in the, exactly as you want it. And so you need to spend some time doing this. To my mind, it's not so important now that a lot of this is so electronic, but still have a colleague or have your computer read your manuscript aloud and follow along on the proofs, just to make sure that, there's been no mistakes in everything that's going on. And then finally, once that final version is accepted, Rich and the rest of the social media folks at AJB click into high gear, and the AJB staff is just really super at spreading information about your article on social media and other kinds of platforms. And so this has become a really important way for your peers to become aware of your work and have access to your work. And so Amy may talk a little bit more about that. But I want to, so what I've tried to do is give you an overview of all the wheels that are turning behind the scenes once you submit a paper, give you a few pointers on how you can make that process go as smoothly as possible with the best outcome possible. But we have this really important thing that I skipped over, which is what happens when you get these comments from the reviewers. So I'm going to turn over to Brittany and let her talk about that.
Real quick before I turn mine back on, I think Rich mentioned this last week, but remember that copy editing process, those 2 to 3 days you have to turn those around. That's going to be the last time to make sure that everybody's names on the paper are the way that you want them to be. If you have a 2-word last name or any kind of diacritical or accent marks that need to be on there correctly, we are all fallible people, and so if any of that doesn't look the way it is, that's the time to get our attention.
I have a question. is it considered appropriate if an author requests to be on an odd number page so they aren't on the backside of somebody else's article? Amy's shaking her head no.
It doesn't really work that way anymore. It did when we were, I mean, might take that into consideration when we had more print. But since we're basically online, every article starts on a right-hand side.
Oh, it does.
Does AJB even print in real life anymore, or is it all electronic?
We have a small number of print on demand.
Okay.
Yes, so we do just, but people are mostly accessing it online.
Okay.
Gotcha. So
I also wanted to ask, do you ever use keywords to help guide?
Oh, yes. Yeah,
Amy's
I will
talk
about
all
that.
about
Yeah.
that here in a few minutes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So we're gonna be right there.
Good. You're
no,
getting
you're
a good.
Don't be
segue.
sorry. That's totally fair.
Yeah.
Let me get mine fired up here. So we sort of skipped the elephant in the room here with how to deal with reviewer comments. So.
And just I want to be, as you get set up, I just want to say that right now we're still dealing with people who review your manuscripts, but it's not in the too far future. Well, we'll probably have artificial intelligence looking at reviewing papers.
Ooh, that's creepy.
Oh,
It is
boy.
terribly creepy. So until we
I'm
get
totally
there.
fine with dealing with humans reviewing papers because I mean, artificial intelligence is getting pretty good, but they do occasionally try to, route me into a swamp down here in Louisiana on my, GPS. So
No, that's right.
all right. So this is probably the part that is most nerve-wracking for newer published scientists. And when you're submitting your first paper, everybody sort of dreads reading the reviews that come back. And this is one of those things where, yes, it's a nerve-wracking process, and yes, nobody likes having their work read. But the thing to remember is that everybody goes through this. So, nobody is, unless you have a reviewer who is just terrible at their job and should never be asked to review again, nobody is looking specifically at trying to run down your paper. A lot of reviewers, at least that I have spoken to, they review papers with the goal in mind of evaluating the science and trying to make the paper better. So even if comments come off as harsh, be aware that oftentimes they're coming from a good faith place. I wanted to throw on here on this sort of introductory slide. We got a lot of questions that were pretty similar when you all submitted your registrations on how to deal with reviewer comment, how do you respond to their comments, how to properly correct things, how to disagree with corrections. The two down here that I wanted to address real quick, because I think maybe the editors would have a better question on this. Is it possible to ask for more time to make changes? Usually when you get back, the editor's feedback, if you get minor or major revisions, those will come with a timeline. Minor revisions, they might want it in 2 weeks or something. Major revisions, 4 weeks or something like that. Is it appropriate and feasible, if there's somebody's coming up on their qualifying exams, or they just don't think they can get the reanalyses done in time, to email the editor and be like, can I have 2 extra weeks or something on this?
Of course.
So, okay. So don't be afraid of asking the editor questions. The worst case scenario is they're going to say, I'm sorry, we can't do that. I don't think anybody is ever going to be like, you asked a question, how dare you? We're going to yank the paper out of the consideration completely. That's not going to happen.
Brianna, do you want to address that, and then I can jump in?
Yeah, I would just say, yeah, absolutely. You can always ask for more time, and normally, we're happy to grant that because something's happening with you and you need that for something that's happening in your life. The times when we cannot do that are when you're part of a special issue that has a hard publication date and we need to get all those papers out. Or we might come back to you and say, we can give you more time, but that means that your paper won't come out in press for another 2 months. So then that becomes a decision that you might have to make about that. So, so those are the things that you might hear back if you don't just hear, yes, absolutely. You might hear one of those answers.
Another answer might be sometimes an author will run into a situation where maybe a co-author is busy on field work for 2 months, or they are having some issue with their data and they need to run all the reanalysis. It's taking longer. If it's going to take more than an extra couple of several weeks or couple weeks, really, we may ask that you withdraw the paper without prejudice and then submit whenever you're ready. And then that way, when you resubmit the paper, we assign it to the same associate editor, your reviews and your response to the reviews go along, and hopefully the evaluation will be faster. But it takes off that ticking clock that makes a lot of people nervous if you don't have a hard deadline. And then it's on your schedule. We give it a new manuscript number and the clock starts over when you resubmit.
Cool. Harold, yeah, what's up?
Do you publish the name of the reviewers in the last issue of the year in which they reviewed? Some journals do, some journals do not.
We do, but it's in the January issue so that we get it's for both AJB and Applications in Plant Sciences. We publish it in the January for the previous year.
But they're not,
not associated with the paper.
Reviewed this
Right.
paper, it's just who reviewed for the year.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right. Just an acknowledgement. Yes.
And that is something that absolutely will differ with each journal. I've got a slide here in a minute on that. So I'll touch on that in just a minute. The last one, I got a couple of questions from people who were like, how can I tell the editor, this is my first paper, be nice, blah, 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 blah. And the thing that I'll say on this is, how much consideration is given to a first-time publisher? I'm going to guess that the answer is none, because we're treating all the papers the same. Your science will hold up to the same standards as everybody else, and that may be intimidating if it's your first paper and you're nervous. But the thing to remember is that if your paper survives review and gets published, that means that you are a scientist. You're not a trainee scientist or a baby scientist. You are a full-fledged, you are a peer now. So yeah, it can be intimidating, but you don't need to have, a special set of review training wheels for your first paper. And I say this as someone who absolutely got an embarrassing comment back from the editor on her first paper because I hadn't done my job the first time, and the reviewer was kind enough to give me a second chance. But don't worry about this being your first paper and having to go through the same review process as everybody else. That's a feature, not a bug. All right, moving on. Harold,
does AJB publish the acceptance rate and the declination rate so someone has some idea how it's reviewed? And are those data shared with people, or do the editors just keep that?
I don't know that we publish it, but we certainly ask, if someone asks the questions, we'll certainly tell them.
Okay. Well, some journals publish it and some don't.
Yeah,
that's right. Some people take it as a badge of honor for their high rejection rate or whatever, or there's all kinds of reasons. So, but I will say, if it's your first paper, I will be really nice to you. Everyone will be really nice to you, and we'll be really nice to you if it's your 100th paper too. So don't.
Well, some people rate the quality of the journal based on the acceptance rate or non-acceptance rate. And so the data are important, but I just don't know how BotSoc shares that, or whether they do or not.
Right.
Well, I have opinions on using rejection rate as a metric that's tantamount to quality, but that's neither here nor there.
That's another conversation for another day.
So anyway, moving on. So what you'll see, and what sort of, the the questions allude to here. Let's see. Is, you know, there are a lot of different, you know, approaches to review that different journals use. You know, the standard ones that you usually will hear about, you will sometimes see these called, you know, single or double blind. That's sort of older terminology that we try to use less for accessibility reasons. You know, more you'll hear single anonymous and double anonymous now. So single anonymous is the author doesn't know the identity of the reviewer, but does know, you know, the reviewers do know the identity of the author. And this describes how AJB and I guess apps also works. You know, so, you know, when I review a paper for either of those journals, I will get, you know, the paper with the title page, with the abstract and all of the authors on it, so I can see who did the work. Other papers will be completely double anonymous, so neither the reviewer nor the authors know who each other are. I've had papers like this before where it got sent back a couple of times because the first time I had, you know, named my manuscript Sutherland et al. So, you know, that doesn't work if it's double anonymous. And sometimes you'll have to, you know, redact, you know, identifying place names, you know, the name of a famous field site or something like that. Open peer review process is the exact opposite, where, you know, you have, you know, everybody knows from the get-go who everybody else is. You know who the authors are, they know who the reviewers are. Transparent peer review, the reviews are posted online, you know, afterwards. You know, you might be able to choose, if you're the reviewer, to screen your identity, but your review will still be made available. Collaborative, you can have more than one reviewer working on a unified review, or the author might review the manuscript under supervision. Post-publication, I don't know how many journals actually do this, but you see this sort of on preprints a lot, where after a manuscript has been put on a preprint archive, you know, people may submit comments and things on it that can get incorporated into the review process later. For a lot of people doing their first review or their first few reviews, you know, journals may encourage that person to review with their PI or with someone who's more experienced. And, you know, so that's a case where two people will work together on a review. You know, different journals might have sort of reviewer training programs or things like that. And I think that's something that AJB has been talking about. So you'll see all sorts of different arrangements, but the most common, I think, still is probably single anonymous. You know, so that's going to be most of what you see out there. All right. So here's the thing about reviews. You know, like we've said before, no one likes having their work judged and getting back reviews, even if they are very helpful reviews. You're gonna have that first knee-jerk evening after you read the reviews of being like, so-and-so is a blithering idiot. They don't know what they're talking about, blah, blah, blah. And then when you know, calm down and think about it, you're like, okay, well, they might have a point on, you know, that first thing. Okay, I'll have to, can somebody take a look at what Rhonda just posted? You know, what I usually do is, you know, I will do a first sort of cursory read, almost a skim of reviews when I get them back. And then I just sit on it. You know, I go watch, you know, whatever my, you know, binge show of the month is, and don't think about it. Let it kind of percolate. And then I'll come back to it, you know, a day or two later, and really start to dig into the reviews, maybe do them a little bit at a time. One thing I usually do is I will either highlight or, you know, on a separate document, sort of copy and paste all the reviews over, and then group them like, okay, both reviewers commented that this particular paragraph is terrible and needs to be fixed or tossed, you know, so any of the reviews where like, the editor and both reviewers commented on the same thing, okay, probably something I need to give some consideration to. So just figure out your plan of attack. And you remember that the goal here is to make your work better. The goal here is not to, troll authors and vent their spleen and, tell you how much your science is terrible. That's not the goal. Everybody in this process wants you to have a more solid paper coming out of it. All right. So after that, that initial sort of knee-jerk response has passed, figure out your plan. If your paper was rejected, that doesn't mean that the revisions are useless. In fact, they've done you a favor. So yes, they're not going to publish your paper, but they have given you a snapshot of what other people will probably have the same comments about when you submit somewhere else. So go ahead and use those comments to revise your work. If this is a reject with the possibility of resubmit situation, go ahead, in that kind of situation, if it's reject and resubmit, the clock is off. You have time. Think about like, okay, is this something where I need to actually put a lot more work into it? Or is this smaller reanalyses that need to be done? Is it something that I can get, turned around in a month? Or is it something where this needs to be next year's project or something like that? So go ahead and think through that. Talk to other people who have published in that journal and similar journals and think about, okay, well, this was a poor fit here. What are my other options? Where else should this look at going? If the journal and the editor didn't give you any feedback on, potentially a sister publication or, something else in their network, that would be a good place to publish. So, if they requested additional data collection or additional analyses, was that on a realistic timeline? And if not, that's when you can go back to the author, to the editors, and say, okay, I can't get this done under this time frame for XYZ reasons. Here's what I would like to do. That will kind of depend. So the question is, how can you know if it's a poor fit or if there are issues that you can fix? Chances are you will be able to sort of suss that out based on the letter the editor writes back to you. For instance, with one that I published that I initially sent to a newer but fancy journal that had been, sort of new on the scene, I submitted one of my PhD chapters to that journal, and it took 4 months to get the reviews back, and I got 4 reviews, all of which were fairly positive, but had a couple of comments are like, well, it's a small data set and blah, blah, blah. And ultimately the editor in chief or the associate editor ruled that ultimately the data set that I had was too small for the claims that I was trying to make. And so they thought it was a little too small minded, I guess, for their big fancy journal. And so in that case, it was a case of both some issues that weren't fixable just because the study had been done, 2 years ago, and I'm not going to be able to resurrect those plants. But some things were fixable in terms of new analyses and things like that, and sort of reframing the picture. But ultimately, they decided that it was a poor fit because they decided that it was too niche, and that's fine. It went to another journal. It got published there within a couple of months because that other journal accepted the reviews that had been done from the first journal. That's something that's fairly common. If you have a paper that gets moved to another journal, they might be open to at least seeing the previous reviews. And that might not mean that you get away with no reviews at the new journal, but it might, reduce it to 1 reviewer or shorten the timeline a little bit. So that's something to ask about. As with so many of these things, it never hurts to ask the question. So don't be afraid of emailing, the managing editor or the editor in chief. And if those aren't the people that you need to talk to, they will direct you to who to talk to. So yeah, never be afraid to comment.
I was going to
Pam?
say, Brittany, that to answer Irene, or different answer to Irene's question, it should be pretty clear from the decision letter, you know, if it's a fit versus, you know, does there need to be some reanalysis or something like that? So
Cool.
it will be clear there.
Okay. All right. Do you need to make every change requested? You should be making most of the changes, but you need to respond to everything. So even if you decide that a particular change, you know, the reviewer was way off base, or they misunderstood something you said, and that caused them to, you know, recommend something that really didn't make any sense, you know, you still need to respond to that comment and say, I'm not going to do, you know, respectfully, I'm not going to do this comment because, and then explain your reasoning. So even if you don't make a change, respond to everything. And for things that are minor, you know, you used and twice in one sentence or something, you know, that can be just, you know, done or fixed or changed. You know, you don't have to write Moby Dick for every single comment. You know, in fact, please don't. But you know, you need to make your review responses easy to follow what you've done. You know, because remember, you know, the editor, when they get this back, and the reviewers, when they get this back, if it goes back out for review, you know, it may have been months since they've seen this. And in the meantime, they've had a dozen other papers to deal with or more. And so they're not going to remember, oh, well, page 5, this was the issue here. So, you know, we are all simple people. So point us where you want us to see changes. Okay. So yes, line numbers are incredibly important. Check the author guidelines and check with the journal. Some journals do things slightly differently. In general, I am a huge fan of continuous line numbering. Some journals you'll see do, you know, restarting the line numbering on each page. And, you know, personally, I'm just like, that's a little bit more of finicky, but, you know, referring to the line numbers. And what I usually do with reviews is I will go ahead and make all of the changes, and on my responses for each one, I'll put line XXX. And because there's no point in putting line numbers that are real until you're done, because they're going to change. And then you're gonna have to go through and shift it by like 2 line numbers on all of your comments. So just something to be aware of. Okay. So they may have very specific requests. You know, some journals may want to see a track changes document. You know, not all, but some will. So make sure you check. And usually, you know, the editor's letter will say so. You know, we'll say what you need to respond with and when. And you need to include a cover letter with your resubmission. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to say the same things as the first cover letter, because at this point, the editor is vaguely familiar with what your paper is about. This is more about, here's the changes that I've made. You know, so these were the big comments that reviewers and the associate editor pointed out. I fixed them in this way, and here are my line by line comments or responses. So what I often do I will just copy over the reviewer comments into the Word document with the cover letter, and then either in a different font or a different color font, I'll make my changes. You know, so after every response, you know, if I have, you know, line comments, you know, line 27, you have a misspelling in blue underneath it, you know, now line 28 fixed, done. So any comments from the gallery so far? Okay. So just to give you, you know, again, a little bit of a pep talk on like, you know, here is a stupid thing that I did and I survived and I now have, you know, a decent job. So even if you have, you know, mistakes that you make in the process, not a big deal. So if you want to take a minute to read through this was the word for word response that I got from the editor-in-chief for my first paper that went into review. And I had submitted revisions that this person had told me to make. And when I got this back, basically in so many words, I was told that I had not actually done what they had asked me to do. So this was slightly embarrassing. But this ended up being a really great paper that has, you know, like 40 something citations now. So, you know, you too will survive getting embarrassing comments back from reviewers or things that seem negative. So it'll be okay. But I have redacted the journal name and the editor's name to protect the innocent. But yeah, so just be aware that, you know, it's not the end of the world if you get something that, you know, sounds rude. Here is an example of a revision cover letter. So this is the cover letter that we sent for that second revision. And so, you know, we said, you know, here is our second revision for this manuscript, and we included the manuscript number just to streamline the process. We appreciate the opportunity to improve the writing, make our work clearer. And then we told them, you know, what did we do in general? You know, don't copy every change that you've made into this part of the document. This is where you're going to talk about it in broad brushstrokes. You know, we've redone these analyses, we've revised the introduction to make it clearer, et cetera, et cetera. And then, you know, the individual comments. So on the right-hand side, you can see for some of the major comments, you know, in black text was the original comments from the reviewers, and in blue is what we did to change and where you can find that change now. In some cases, if you had to, you know, heavily revise one sentence, it might not hurt to put that new sentence in quotes with the line numbers, you know, so that way the reviewers and the editor don't have to go back to the document. They can see what the new text looks like and be like, okay, yeah, that works for me. But, you know, so it's going to kind of depend on what they've asked you to do, what's going to be most appropriate. You know, if it's a writing revision like that, that's short and you can just plug it in there in the response letter, great. If it's something to do with a reanalysis, you know, you probably shouldn't plug a giant table into the response letter. But you can say, you know, we have now done the Tukey analysis requested from reviewer 2 on line such and such. Minor comments in line. So in general, and not every reviewer will structure things this way. The way I tend to structure things is I will write sort of an overview of what the paper was. So my understanding of what the authors were trying to do, my general impressions of the work, what I thought, you know, were the strengths and the weaknesses. And then I have a section on major comments. Those are ones that are either, you know, big writing issues that I found or issues with the science. And then minor comments and line edits are, you know, I find your logic weird with this one particular sentence, or it doesn't make any sense, or, you know, there's, you know, ambiguity in the language or something like that. So in this case, these were, you know, minor comments and line edits that we have gotten on, I think, the same paper. So I miss a citation and a direct context to the previous sentence and the whole study. So basically, this is a weirdly worded way of saying you didn't cite your work properly. Okay, so, well, citation has been added and here's where it is. Like 2, so good. You know, so let's see. Here's one where I had just used the wrong word. I was talking about a principal coordinates analysis and I had called it a PCA. So, like, you know, easy fix, done. So in a lot of cases, you know, for the smaller things, it's not a lot of work here. You literally just have to say, okay, I fixed it on this line. Here's where you can find it, moving on.
And I'll just pop in here, Brittany, and say, you've done such a good job of explaining like why, although it's painful, these are really useful. And this is such a great example. I mean, I would pay someone to give me this level of feedback on my writing, right? Like this is so detailed and they put so much attention to literally fixing the tiniest, telling you these tiny things that are wrong, but fixable with your paper. And as you said, a stronger paper results. So even though the peer review process is painful, it's so helpful as well.
And when I got the feedback on this paper, I think the original review was like 5 pages long or something, huge. And I'm like, oh my God, there is so much work here. But it, like you said, it absolutely resulted in a stronger paper. And once I got through it, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. But yeah, when you first see it, it's like, that's why you got to read it and step back because it just looks bad. All right. So I'm going to put a few more examples of how to do these in the Google Drive that I will resend on email. And I think, we'll stop there and let Amy chime in and hopefully finish on time. So
thank you, Brittany, for all your good advice and just terrific. Let me see if I can find my slides here. Okay. Okay, can you see my slides now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, terrific. Thank you everyone for staying with us through this presentation today. And thank you, Brittany, for your good advice and helping people respond to reviewers. I will add that a lot of the comments that you receive from the reviewers are sent to your co-authors, and sometimes your co-authors will want to respond with a reply all. And so we see some of those comments, especially heartbreaking sometimes, but so that's just to keep in mind. It doesn't happen as much as it used to, but the reply all button is always
also addition, if you send a track changes document, make sure that any comments that were between you and your other authors that were a little snarky, I've seen some of those left on before. So just remove the snark before you send it back in.
If you can, we do understand. So, but okay, so I'm Amy McPherson. I've been with the BSA Publications since 2005. And prior to that, I was with the Missouri Botanical Garden Press, which is just to say that I've been in this business for a long time. I love it. I love working with authors and editors and reviewers. And I'm going to talk today about something a little bit different that we never thought about a long time ago, but you need to be thinking about these days. And it's about how I think Pam mentioned that you're writing for many different audiences, and your published paper will be read by both humans and machines. And what I mean by maybe it's robots in the future, but really it's probably artificial intelligence, search engines, algorithms that are evaluating your work. So there's lots of challenges in publishing, right? We have over 3 million scholarly articles being published each year, and that's increasing by about 6%. Probably it increased even more during the pandemic. A lot of papers were published while people were stuck at home. I know there's some disparity in the papers that were able to be published, but it did increase the output quite a bit. Open access is increasing about 26% per year in the plant sciences. So there's a lot of information out there. A lot of the scientific literature is published in English, and that's not fair in this world, but it is sort of a reality right now. It may change. But the point being that you really need to communicate clearly and concisely so that people who are fluent in English or maybe not fluent in English can understand your work, and also so the artificial intelligence can understand what you're trying to say. So, which is just to say, and I think we've beat this probably a lot, is that people and machines are interacting with your work. So you worked so hard on your paper to get it published and to pass it through peer review. And so one of the important things is to help people find it and for you also to get credit for the work that you're doing. So it's great if you can publish with the same name over your career, but there's lots of reasons why this may change over time. Maybe when I first started out, I was Amy Schuler, and now I'm Amy McPherson. And so sometimes I might publish with Amy Schuler McPherson, or it might be A McPherson or A S McPherson, or maybe there's someone else who comes into the field whose last name is also McPherson, first name Amy, or first initials. Anyway, you get my point. There's lots of reasons why we need to disambiguate who people are in this field. So that's why many years ago they came up with an ORCID, which is an Open Researcher and Contributor ID. If you don't have an ORCID, you should get one. It's free. It takes about 5 minutes. This is just a number that identifies you, Brittany Sutherland, as Brittany Sutherland, the botanist, publishing on the work you do. The ORCID, it's called an ORCID ID. It's often published with the article. Usually the corresponding author is required. Some of the co-authors are requested or recommended, but not required. Credit is another, it's another way of identifying the contributor roles in a multi-authored paper. So let's say you have 6 authors. There's the first author and there's the last author. You kind of think you know what they do, but there's lots of people in the middle, and maybe the first and last author shared a lot of the same responsibilities. So this is just a taxonomy to sort of lay out who did what. Did you collect the data? Maybe you did the writing and the reviewing and the data analysis. There's lots of things. This was to try to get credit for people, thus the name. And then there's Publons, which is a reviewer recognition service. When you do a review for a journal, they may ask if you want Publons credit. And that is just, Publons is owned by Clarivate, which is the Web of Science people. So everything is coordinated. These are, by having this metadata essentially assigned to your number, your ID number, these systems can talk to each other. So you can have an ORCID ID profile that lists your Publons credits, and basically it just makes sure that can you still, I think I've frozen, there we go, okay. So Publons, integrates with all these, with your ORCID, with credit, with everything else, so that it creates online a digital profile of your professional your professional affiliations. And something that Wiley and other publishers are doing as well is offering authors the opportunity to change their name. So you published a paper, maybe you published a paper 2 years, 6 years ago, and since that time you got married, you got divorced, you had a gender change, you changed your name for any kind of reason. So I'm going to read this, I think, just so I don't get it wrong. But in cases where authors wish to change their name following publication, Wiley will update and republish the paper and redeliver the updated metadata to indexing services. So we don't need to tell your co-authors, we don't have to make a correction. It's just done seamlessly, and it's because there's all these machines, all this metadata underneath the published article that can follow a person, a name online. That was kind of an innovation never heard of 10, 20 years ago. So you're also looking to optimize your paper for search engines, and that's called, as you know, search engine optimization, or SEO. Google is responsible for many searches. The majority of searches online, probably somewhere between 79 to 91% of searches are started with Google or Google Scholar. So they have algorithms that change, and we don't really know what they are. We do know that they have 200 variables or so. So I'm going to talk just a second about some of those you can really pay attention to. But if you pay attention to the SEO on your first draft, you're going to drive yourself crazy, because there's lots of changes that are going to happen between the initial submission and the final acceptance. So it's something to sort of narrow or focus in on as the paper gets closer to acceptance, I would say. So some of the very important things are the title. And the title is your advertisement to the world of what your paper is about. I personally love a good pun. But if you've ever tried to tell a joke to Alexa or Siri, they don't get it. So a machine is not going to understand. And what Google looks for when they create their search engine and put it rankings is the first few words of your title. So you want to put the most important keywords at the front of your title if you can. There's lots of other advice on the Wiley Author Services page, but sometimes when you're appealing to people, if you're giving a talk at a meeting, you may want to have a clever title. I'm not saying don't have a clever title, but just understand it may not be the best thing for search engine optimization. The abstract is usually provided to people for free. So this is worth spending your time on to make sure that it's clear. You say what you want to say. You're not writing a novel. You're not keeping anything in suspense. You want people to know what your paper's about so that they can decide if they want to read it further. And also you want to include these keywords. And I think Harold had asked about keywords. And yes, we have keywords, and these are very important. What they do is they're indicators of what is important in your paper. They help showcase your research to interested readers, which increases the chances of your paper being discovered and cited. So most academic journals, search engines, and indexing abstracting services classify articles from keywords. So it's worth spending some time. And also to see if your keywords are effective, put them in a search engine. See if you come up with articles that are similar to the ones you've just written. So that's my advice there. You also, it's to your advantage to promote your work so people can find your work. So you can do this through many ways, presenting at conferences, of course, talks, posters, organizing symposia or colloquia. Sometimes your symposia or colloquia can develop into a special issue for a journal, in which case then you get more exposure and you get the behind the scenes look for yourself of the editing process. And it's also good for the journal, and it's also good for getting your science out there. I'm also going to put in a plug for social media outreach. A lot of people are not looking so much at tables of contents like they did 15, 20 years ago, but they're looking at science Twitter. Twitter can be many things, but it can be a great place to find what your peers or your friends or people you admire are publishing. It's a great way to find articles that are recently published. And your friends at the BSA promote your articles on social media. These are our main tags for Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So every paper that we publish in AJB, every paper we publish in Applications in Plant Sciences get a shout out, and we get amplification through Wiley. We will tag their social media channels and get even more exposure that way. You can also talk to your public information officers at your institution. Sometimes if you're doing really cool stuff, they want to know because they want to write a press release. And if you let us know, then we help amplify that, that message as well. You can also, there's newsletters out there. Botany One is a newsletter that comes out every week, and we get really excited when we have articles featured there, or if you have a press release, they'll pick up on those kinds of things. If you write a blog or a podcast. These are other ways to promote your work so other people can find your work. And sometimes, if you do a search, these things are gonna come up there as well. Other ways to draw people in are graphical abstracts. I don't know how many of you are working on graphical abstracts, and you may think, oh my gosh, I am so tired of this paper. I wrote it a long time ago. They asked me to make so many changes. Why would I want to do more? Well, it's another way to draw people in. Some people have a real gift for seeing visually, and for a lot of people that really helps them to understand whether or not they want to read the paper. Graphical abstracts are great for social media. People really tend to like and retweet graphical abstracts. Rich can back me up there, or a table of contents. We can include the graphical abstract in a table of contents. And some things that are also coming down the pike are plain language summaries. If you're not doing those now, this is a way to sort of make your very scientific paper accessible to people who might benefit from your research. And it's just taking all the jargon out, putting it in plain language. A lot of our highlights. We publish highlights from AJB, and we work with the authors, and it's really hard. It's really hard to write a non-jargon, plain language summary about your work because you're very close to it, but is another way to draw people in who may not have been able to sit through or to read through your entire paper, but maybe really would if they could sort of see, I don't want to say dumbed down, but just a simplified version of your work.
Amy and Rich, do either of you have recommendations or could send me some materials on graphical abstracts that I could throw into the Google folder for people?
We'll be working on that. Yes, yes. And we will have a whole list of other resources for you in that folder. Another thing that we're starting to do for both journals is also abstracts in languages other than English. If your work was done in Colombia and it would be easier for your colleagues who are really interested in your work to read an abstract in Spanish, for example, you can provide that and we can post that. And I'd like to give a shout out, if you take really gorgeous photographs, you should take pictures or plan ahead with beautiful images. Maybe you could be featured on the cover, and that's another way to draw people into your research. And I've included one of our really pretty covers on this slide, and it's behind Rich's face on his Zoom photo right there. So because people and machines will be reading your paper, the metadata identifies the parts of your manuscript. So the authors, the affiliations, the words. It seems tedious, but it's really important. It's important because artificial intelligence can tell the way things are tagged, what part of the manuscript they're looking for, what part of the manuscript they're looking at, and how they can connect that to other pieces in their little robot brains, I guess. Also, data miners, people are looking at papers for all kinds of reasons, and if it's structured well and the metadata is strong, then it helps folks. And also for screen readers, which is something I hadn't really appreciated until recently, but screen readers are available on your phones, and if you don't or can't read an article, your screen reader, artificial intelligence, can read it for you, and it relies on having the proper structure and things. So that's why it's very important. And there are also machine assisted tools that can help you if grammar and spelling are not your strengths. They can help you communicate with other people. These are just a couple of examples: Grammarly and Writeful. Also, accessibility. So 15% of our readers have some sort of disability. So we want to make sure that everyone has access to our science. So that's why writing clearly and concisely in a well-structured format is so important, just for comprehension as well, for people, as well as for assistive devices. Think about images. Color is really great, but don't use color alone to convey information, because 5 to 10% of people in this world have some sort of color blindness. Tables, they need proper structure so they can be coded properly. If you have a gorgeous table and you just take a picture of it and put it into your paper, that's no good for anyone, because it doesn't make sense to somebody. And if you give links, this is something else I hadn't really considered. You should give them text, title, instead of just click here. And since we can't get away with talking about publications without at least touching on a few ethical issues, I'm going to touch upon these now, but we could have a whole other discussion with case studies and stuff, but we won't do that today. So it's just to remind people that the submission of a manuscript to a journal is both an ethical and a legal undertaking. We require certain declarations at submission. Mostly we're going to say, this is my work. If I've used other work, I give it proper attribution. A failure to meet any legal undertaking is serious and an ethical breach. All kinds of situations you can get yourself into big trouble by not being ethical in your publications. We have clear guidelines, and we use the Committee on Publication Ethics, which has a whole series of flowcharts that we follow if something goes awry. And Wiley also has resources for authors on research integrity and publishing, if you'd like to know more about that. So the few issues that I'm going to touch upon here are intellectual copyright, which is that you can only publish a paper where you and your co-authors own the intellectual property in the paper, or you have secured permission to publish or republish work not owned by you. So that's pretty straightforward. Plagiarism, and that is using work that's not your own without due and full credit. And this is something that we, every journal pretty much out there today will run an authenticate check, which is to check to make sure that there's not a lot of overlap. We actually get a report on every revision on what kind of overlap there is with articles in the general public. Now, if you posted your paper on a preprint, we're going to get a high similarity report. So that's why a human actually looks behind the machines to see what the overlap is and where it came from. But you'd be surprised because people get very clever in sort of changing things just a little bit so it doesn't get picked up by the machine. And that's where our reviewers, our human reviewers, usually come in and say, hey, wait a minute, I know I've read some of this before, and if we do a deeper dive, we'll find out what the situation was, and then it's not really good for anyone. So don't do it. Redundant publishing is sometimes, it's just publishing the same paper, almost the same paper again and again. Sometimes they call it salami slicing. When you sign up with the journal, you're telling them that this is an original article. Fabrication, falsification, or obfuscation of data should be self-explanatory. They're kind of big, fancy words, but just don't make stuff up. Don't manipulate your images to make them. And if you do manipulate your image, tell us how you did it so that we know everything is transparent and we understand what we're looking at. Misappropriation of information. Don't use the research data findings of others without permission to do so and without full acknowledgement. And the thing that you might be a little surprised, maybe not, resubmitting rejected work without changing it is not ethical either, because the reviewer pool is very small. So it's a good likelihood that if your paper is rejected at one journal, it'll be sent to another journal and the same reviewers will see, I commented on this, nothing has changed, and that doesn't reflect well on you. At the end of the day, I've just got 2 more slides. I think we're almost there. A journal article is more than just the text and figures. The metadata allows systems to talk to each other. I think we've mentioned this before. And the manuscript submission systems automate some of the processes. And this is changing all the time. So if you think you finally got it down, how to submit to a journal that uses editorial manager, next time it might be slightly different. We used to have people, you have to copy and paste the article, but now a lot of that is just taken from the paper, harvested, as they say, from the manuscript itself. So the systems and their algorithms change frequently. Just to keep in mind that the only thing constant is change. There's a lot of information published every day. It takes effort to be discovered. I encourage you to put in the effort if you can. And I also want to say that society journals were self-published for the longest time, but we're not anymore. And so we often partner with larger publishers to take advantage of their infrastructure, down this information superhighway, right? And because they have economies of scale that independent societies can't really do on our own. And a few final pieces of advice. I know it looks like there's lots of questions maybe in the chat, which we'll get to in just a second, I hope. But behind the systems, behind the machines, people are writing these algorithms, right? Some of them are quite interesting. There's whole books on how algorithms are written. But behind the systems at a journal, there are people. The managing editors, reviewers, associate editors, editors-in-chief, and as a rule, we're all humans at this point. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Always be respectful. We're all working to publish good science. It's okay to be snarky among yourselves, but we're all it's worth spending a little bit of extra time just to be respectful. If you think a step in the process of any process is taking too long, inquire. Sometimes that really helps. And sometimes our machines are doing things that we weren't aware of that have to get fixed. If you're really pleased with the feedback you receive, don't be shy about expressing that. We don't get a lot of positive feedback all the time, but same if you are
Except for Rich, who always gets spanked.
That's right. That's right. If you are concerned that some of the feedback was not constructive, point that out too. That's important for us to know. Share your science with the broader community. Go out there and make a difference in the world. The world needs more people who know and care about plants. And now, questions.
So Amy, I think you noticed that there was a bunch of chat going around. And I think the only question that hasn't been answered is about the non-technical abstracts and the other language, non-English abstracts. Do those actually get published with the article, or are they available in some other format, or how's that going to work?
Yes, so the plain language summaries, which I just discovered, can be published right after the abstract. And they're indexed then. So it's part of the search engines will find it. For some medical journals, and I don't know about botanical journals, so there's actually a site that will publish just the plain language summaries separate from the article and linked back and forth. And the other question was, the abstracts in another language, they can be uploaded. We have to add this to our author guidelines, but you can upload an abstract in another language. It won't really be edited by the editorial office because we're not fluent in multiple languages, but it will be provided as an online supplement. So it's available right there with the article.
Yeah, and I just want to pop in here and say, because Applications in Plant Sciences is fully open access, we'll actually be able to we can post the entire paper in the second language as supplementary online as well. AJB has some constraints because of their model of publication right now. So we'll be able to do both the abstract and the full publication in a second language. But as Amy says, we won't be able to copy edit that other language version. So yeah. Yeah.
Sorry to kind of just jump in for a second. I've got to run. I've got another engagement. Can I make somebody else co-host? Anybody gonna stick around for a little while?
I can stay.
Okay. Yes. So I'll make let's see, I'll make Amy co-host for now. And then I'm